What are the advantages and challenges in collaborations between neuroscientists and philosophers when studying free will?
One advantage is when you talk to people who are outside your discipline, it forces you to pull back and really ask, what kind of question am I even asking? What would be the kind of answer that would answer that question? What should I expect from an answer to this question? And if you're talking to people within your own little bubble, you expect everyone's on the same page, everyone understands the lay of the land. You're never forced to really pull all the way back and ask very, very fundamental questions. So when we talk to neuroscientists, I'm a philosopher, when neuroscientists talk to me, we often find ourselves just not understanding each other and forcing ourselves to get the conversation back on track. You have to pull all the way back. Sometimes the experimental work forces me or encourages me to ask precise questions that I hadn't asked myself. I'd use this concept. I see an experiment that goes this way, an experiment that goes that way, and I think to myself, how can I precisify, make my concept more precise? I feel like I need to make a distinction. How should I make it? And I think, so the neuroscientific work forces philosophers to be more precise. I think philosophical questions can also force the neuroscientist to be precise, right? They thought they run an experiment, they thought the way to interpret it was this way. We say, well, there's two interpretations. And now they have to go back and be more precise in their methods. So I think both at the level of detail, but also at this grand overarching, what are we trying to do here? We keep each other honest, I think, and that's a good thing.
I think that's the way to study free will. So as far as I'm concerned, when I have the huge advantage and privilege to send my methods file to philosophers and get feedback from them, having them read it and try to convey the philosophical meaning of the different types of experimental conditions, for me, that is just amazing, because that gives me another layer of criticism, another layer of thinking. I think that the experiments become deeper and more meaningful. So as far as I'm concerned, if I could do that my entire life, then I'm happy.
Philosophy without science is empty. Science without philosophy is blind. We can both help each other. Philosophers go out into abstractions, and you need to try to pin it down in a scientific framework, with appropriate definitions that you can test in the lab. But scientists often forget about the forest, and just look at the trees, and they've got all these little fine details. But what does it all amount to? What does it all mean? And how do you decide to do this experiment instead of that experiment? The scientists gain from kind of raising the larger issues and increasing their perspectives, and the philosophers gain by the scientists bringing them back down to earth.
Scientists, when they're left to themselves, they are blind to certain aspects of decision-making that are difficult to study. For example, moral responsibility is something that's very difficult to study in experiments, certainly in brain imaging experiments. And also, we tend to gravitate towards very simple, I'd say, natural science explanations of things. And I think in that way, we bypass the kind of moral intuitions that everyday people have when they make decisions. And I think a big advantage of discussing with philosophers is to be persistently challenged.
I was speaking with Manuel Vargas, and he pointed out a really nice thought. He made a really nice point, I thought, which is that the incentive structures in the two fields are set up oppositely. So the incentive structures for the scientist is to get data and then interpret it to be a great big result. Whereas the incentive structures for philosophers are to say something that is that's defensible, that's not easily argued with, and yet gets attention.
This is a very important relationship that I have appreciated through this consortium that we are working with. I think philosophers are able to identify questions that are important and that can come up with clarity that sometimes is not clear in neuroscience experiments. Neuroscientists, to some extent, study what we can study. I'm a neuroscientist, so I use we for that reason. So to some extent, we study what we can study, but philosophers make it clear what it's important to study.
The disadvantage is the disadvantage of any interdisciplinary work. And so the disadvantage of any interdisciplinary work is that that neuroscientists and philosophers or of any discipline are used to talking to other folks within their fields. They share the same background assumptions. All that goes away when you go to a kind of interdisciplinary contexts. The upside is that you get tremendous opportunities for learning things that you never otherwise would have had an opportunity to learn. And sometimes you even get insights that you think might be promising for figuring out how to pull together an answer for a famously difficult problem like free will.
I mean, I think my answer to this is probably pretty common amongst us scientists and philosophers working in this group, which is that, well, for one thing, it slows things down. And that can be a good thing because it causes us to think more critically about our arguments and about the way we design our experiments before getting into them. And so that can be a good thing. And I think the other is that we speak different languages. And so we have to kind of be very deliberate in our conversations and sort of translating between the different languages that we speak so that we understand each other. And again, that sort of slows things down, but that can be a good thing.
Following this collaboration, how can an abstract notion like free will be probed experimentally?
I think that when neuroscientists started looking into free will, they had this idea that in one fell swoop, one experiment, they would tell you whether we do or don't have free will. I think that most neuroscientists don't think like that anymore. And the idea is that we kind of chip away at the question. We answer some aspect here, some aspect there, and then with time we would get closer to it. But and I think that's the right approach rather than just one experiment to rule them all.
So I think it depends on what we mean by probing an abstract notion like free will experimentally. So in one sense, we can't probe the abstract notion before we haven't done a lot of conceptual groundwork, i.e. we get clear on what we mean by free will. Is it a compatibilist notion of free will? How important is reason's responsiveness, etc.? So many of these things have to be done theoretically and can't be directly probed experimentally. But once we have at least hypotheses about what free will could be theoretically, then one should hope that they can be tested experimentally, whether these things exist or in which form they exist and how they fit with our pre-theoretical notions of how free will should operate.
So my inclination would be to think that what we want to do is to look at which functions of the mind we have in mind, and then try to constrain our experimental methods to probe those functions.
One of the things that I think has been quite exciting about this collaboration is exactly the notion of trying to formulate operational definitions to some of these issues like freedom and many others, and therefore try to probe them experimentally. So the Libet task, I think, was one initial attempt to do that, but it's clearly, there has been a strong criticism of many aspects of these tasks. And now we have a plethora of tasks created by this consortium that allows us to probe in a much deeper way.
I think if you want to study free will, you first need to decide what you mean with that. And there are many different things that people mean when they use the term free will. Lay people use the term differently than a lot of philosophers, than theologians, psychologists, and so on. So I think you first have to say what you mean. Do you mean that there are alternate possibilities? If you want to test for alternate possibilities experimentally, it's more a question of physics than it is, so basically things like the causal closure of the universe or thermodynamics and things like that. That's more how you would go about looking at alternate possibilities, I think. If you're interested in control, so free will means I'm in control of my actions, so they're somehow regulated within my brain by me, myself, I think then it's a question of cognitive neuroscience, and you want to say, what are the situations where I have more control, less control?
The notion of free will and our intuitive understanding of it seems very simple, but actually when you unpack it, it's complicated to understand free will and moral responsibility and how that plays out. And it's going to draw upon different scientific domains, not just neuroscience, but more social sciences because of pervasive social influence on human behavior.
So I think the experimental probing here is going to have to happen at multiple levels. So if you think about free will as as I was characterizing it before, as a practice-dependent concept, then partly we're going to need an apt characterization of the practice. And one way to study that might be to study human social practices and what are the conditions under which we're inclined to blame and not blame. And I think there are a variety of ways that we can study that empirically. But once we've done that, we still need to know what's going on in the head and whether or not our practices are attaching to real features of the world, whether or not they're capturing, as sometimes people put it, the joints of the world. And that's going to involve paying attention to distinctions like whether people did things intentionally or unintentionally, and what do we count as a decision and not. And so we might have everyday ways that you and I will talk about those things. But then there's this interesting open question about whether or not the underlying brain architecture of human beings maps onto the everyday discourse that we use to talk about those things.
Well, it is very difficult, but as we have discussed during the past years, the Libet type of experiments is not sufficient. It doesn't say very much about free will. I think free will would include deliberation and perhaps even moral considerations. And also we cannot just measure free will. We have to have a subject that is reporting on the experience during a free will situation. So it's very difficult to make it in animals, for example. But I do believe that animals have free will, but it's much more difficult to get into their minds. And if we, of course, could predict, if we, with the data and maybe simulations and so forth, can predict what another person will do very closely, far beyond what the person, him or herself, can say, then that would be an argument against free will, of course. So I think this with the prediction is an important aspect of experiments.
So if volition or free action must be reasons responsive, or in other words, not the Libet type task, then how should we think about Libet type actions? Are they just a degenerate case of decision making where value is null or nil? Or is there something that's fundamentally distinct about them that makes them different from other kinds of decisions?
So I think that they are more of a degenerate case. They're basically a case of symmetry breaking, and that's how I would view them. They're not that interesting.
When you look at decisions, there are decisions where there's a lot of stake. For example, you can earn a lot of money if you make the right decision. And there are decisions that appear arbitrary. And a lot of philosophers believe that decisions where there's a lot at stake, where we can bring in our values and our motives and things like that and our reasons, are decisions where we feel free. And we've done research asking lay people, and it turns out that it's quite the opposite. Those decisions where we feel kind of there's nothing at stake, it's arbitrary, those are the decisions where people feel most free.
In my opinion, these decisions are artificial constructs that people have invented in the lab, but actually don't have a parallel in real life to a greater extent. So as far as I'm concerned, it's been an interesting intellectual experience reading about those and studying those, but when I try to do it myself, it feels so foreign to everything else that we do that I'm not sure that they are a very good model for decision-making or volitional actions.
I do think that they're, in some sense, a degenerate case of decision-making, for which not so much that value is nil, but you have no reasons for acting one way or the other. So because in the Libet task you have to do something, there needs to be some way to choose one or the other option. And I think that in that case, the brain just uses what it has, for instance, noise, in order to help drive a decision system to one option or the other.
I think there is something distinct about them. So I've been one of the people who've been saying for a very long time that lipid actions have been misunderstood as because they are not helpful for understanding responsible action and what makes us responsible. But I do think there is something that's interesting about them because I think they target an intuition that's very strongly connected with special forms of free will, especially libertarian free will, i.e. this sense that we can go either A or B, independent of reasons. And I do think testing that experimentally is an interesting and important domain.
What are the expected neuro and physical differences between, on one hand, a free will zombie, let's say, who does not have free will, but retains the psychological feeling of having free will, and another being who does have free will, but maybe not the psychological feeling of having that free will?
A person that does have free will but doesn't recognize it, that does happen from time to time, of course. That is something that we see in different patient circumstances. And in those situations, we can look at the brain activity and identify what's going on and the reason for the lack of understanding of free will. Generally, at the moment, we can see that they have a failure of the agency network.
It's a complicated thing because it kind of like it implies they can't be simultaneously true. So I can't say what the differences are because they can't simultaneously be true. Okay, you could have two different cases. One is a person who thinks there are alternate possibilities, so they come to a decision point and they think that there are different possibilities for them to go, but it's already kind of predetermined what they're going to do. And the other person thinks there are no alternatives, but it isn't constrained what they're going to do. And I'd say these two agents don't live in the same universe, because in a universe that is described by the laws of nature that we have, I don't think there are alternate possibilities, whereas the second person might exist, the first person won't exist. So, yeah.
What do you think is the strongest argument or evidence for and against free will?
I think that the question is ill-posed. I think that the right way to think about free will is not as existing or does not exist. I think it's a matter of degree rather than do we or don't we have it.
So I generally think that we have to try to explain scientific phenomena with the least number of external ad hoc hypotheses. So I do not see an evident role for freedom. I think that we can explain all the phenomenology around volitional decisions without the need to invoke any non-physical system, any magic juice, anything extraordinary that cannot be accounted for by neurons, spikes, and their interactions.
To me, it's more a matter of a definition rather than an argument for and against. So what happened to me was that with time, I understood that my more intuitive understanding of this question of, could I have done otherwise or couldn't have I done otherwise was very important at the time, but now seems to be, for me at least, somewhat obsolete with respect to what we now know and think. So to me, it's not a matter of having an argument for and against. It's more, how do you define free will and what do you demand of your actions or decisions in order to call them free?
Well, I don't really think that you can make an argument for free will, but there are data that could count against it. And I don't think we have those data yet. But if you could predict someone's actions well before they perform them without them knowing it, and know fully well what they're going to do several seconds into the future with near perfect accuracy, that would be something that might argue against free will.
If by free will means the ability to make reasonable decisions that are not bound by one's immediate environment, but take into account one's reasons, one's motivations, one's goals, one's commitments, and to do so in a flexible and rational way, Well, I think that commitment is bound up in our everyday interaction with people. I don't think you need complicated, detailed neural studies. I don't think you need EEG or fMRI to show that. It's part of our interactions with people that you and I have this capacity. Many animals don't. People with severe brain damage might not. My 2-year-old doesn't have much of it. He's getting a little bit of it.
I think the strongest evidence is our ability to control our actions in light of reasons, because that's what I mean by free will. Now, other people mean different things by free will. They mean free as opposed to determined. And I don't know how we figure out determinism in the brain, because there are inputs coming into the brain all the time. It's not a closed system. So if that's what you mean by free will, I don't know that there is going to be much evidence one way or the other. But if you mean control of your actions, we can test people by offering them incentives and seeing how they react to those incentives. And we can test them when they have reasons against doing things and see if they can stop themselves from doing it. Like if they're an addict and there's a reason not to keep taking the drugs, will they be able to stop? Those kinds of control factors we can study scientifically. And that's one reason I think that's probably the most important and interesting form of free will.
I don't think there's a single strongest piece of evidence for it, but I think the question's a little bit like the question, what's the strongest evidence for the existence of love? And so I think the answer to that's going to turn out to be some combination of the fact of our social practices, that there are things we care about and talk about as being about free will, or that free will is implicated in those things. And then we have to go and show that we're not just kind of manufacturing features about the world, but there's really something out there that we're tracking. So I think the strongest evidence for it's going to have to be some combination of careful attention to social practices and then careful attention to figure out whether or not any of the kinds of things that we talk about when we talk about free will turn out to actually have any structure in the world when we're talking about these things.
How would you characterize the relationship, if any, between consciousness and free will?
So I think lots of people think that consciousness is very important for free will, and it's certainly important to be aware of the external things we're controlling, if we're going to control them. So if you think about free will, I like to think about it in terms of control, and then being aware of objects, or even of your own bodily movements. If you're not aware of them, it's going to be hard to feel like you're in control of them. But I think we get confused because I think we think that we would also need to be similarly aware of those aspects of our mind by which we're controlling those other things, as though we need to control the activities by which we're controlling things. But that seems to me unnecessary. It seems to me that it's enough that we're able to control either our emotions or the external objects and be aware of them. And the fact that, as was shown in the Libet experiment, et cetera, that we're not consciously aware of those aspects of our mind seems to me unimportant for free will.
Right. So the notion of free will in my own understanding of it is it is an aspect of consciousness. Consciousness, in my definition, are the things of which you are aware. And free will is one of those things that you are aware of. So it would be a quali. A quali is an element of consciousness, and that's what their relationship would be.
So a lot of people believe that consciousness is a necessary condition for free will. So basically, if something happens in my brain unconsciously and makes a decision, I would not think that this is an expression of my freedom. I need to be aware of the decision, and then I'm free. I think you can challenge that, because you can say, well, I might respond habitually, for example, to a certain situation, or automatically, without thinking about it. But I have a history of training myself to respond in a certain way. So, for example, let's just say I'm a smoker, I want to stop smoking. I might then not take the cigarette, but because I've trained myself in the past to avoid smoking these cigarettes. So I was able to resist the temptation, but I don't have to think about it consciously in that situation. But you could still think of that as some form of control that we have that you might call free will.
I think one reason that consciousness is important for free will in some or maybe many of the cases that we're really concerned about freedom in is that this is my hunch, that being conscious of one's reasons and the consequences of actions and stuff like that gives you the ability to deliberate, step back, reassess, and it's that kind of higher order deliberation that I think we value in freedom in hard choices.
I think that relationship comes up at least the way that we think about free will. Whether or not it comes up in free will per se, I don't know. But when you ask someone a question about free will and whether or not they think they have it, I think what they're thinking about is whether or not their conscious thoughts seem to cause their actions. And so from that point of view, from the perspective of the folk notion of free will, I think that idea of consciousness is built in. And if you were to ask me just personally, not as a scientist, what kind of free will would you want? I'd want the conscious kind.
Do you think it is possible to provide a simple and unambiguous mathematical definition of the terms awareness, consciousness, and attention?
Yeah, you can just stipulate a number, but it's probably a bad answer. Beyond that, I don't know. I have no idea.
No, I don't think we can produce a mathematical definition of a rock. These are physical things that happen. It's not going to be pure mathematics. It's got to be using mathematics to interpret the empirical data. And so we're never going to be able to say, attention is 74.3. It's going to be a certain configuration of neural processes that are probably distributed throughout large parts of the brain. So mathematics will be part of what we use to analyze those concepts, but it'll never be enough by itself.
No. I mean, so a simple and unambiguous mathematical definition of awareness, consciousness, and intention, we could stipulate something. We could say that we will mean by awareness, we will mean by intention this, but the word intention, to take one of those, has a life outside of science, and in fact has a home, I think, outside of science, and a home in a set of social interactions where it matters to us whether it's true of someone that they intend.
No, not simple and unambiguous. It's actually a very difficult thing to do, but we are trying to do that in our modeling, actually. So, and that is our greatest challenge, to find ways to represent these concepts at a very high level of a mental level that is not so easy to measure. So it's difficult to make that into mathematics, but we are trying actually to do that. But it's not simple and it's not unambiguous. So I don't think that's possible.
Perhaps one of my favorite mathematical definitions right now is the idea that of integrated information theory that has been put forward by Giulio Tononi initially and now championed by people like Christoph Koch and many others. What's particularly elegant, I think, is exactly the mathematical formulation, the rigorous axiomatic the definitions, and the idea that one can actually quantify different states of consciousness. That said, in practice, it remains pretty challenging to compute, almost intractable with current methods. And furthermore, the theory makes very counterintuitive predictions.
For attention, I think the answer is yes. For awareness, I think, and consciousness, the jury is out.
Some decisions are considered to be biased to a certain degree or under certain conditions, without this endangering free will as a whole. Where would you draw the line after which the decision is unfree or without moral responsibility?
At what point does the bias or the pressure, is it a bit like me simply picking up your hand and moving your body where you've got no control? I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't know how we should go about answering it. Even worse, right? I don't know what methods we should use. One starting point thinking about it is, at what point does bias and influence change how we experience control over actions?
So I think the question's in some sense a little bit like asking, where do we draw the line for foul calls in a sport? And the answer to that question is going to be something like, well, look, we can look at a rule book, but the answer that's ultimately going to be given to us isn't just, where do we happen to draw the line, but why do we call those fouls in the first place? And if you think the answer is something like to protect the players, to preserve the flow of the game, the entertainment of the audience, then I think thinking of it as a social practice in that way, we're going to have to do something similar with that or similar to that in the case of free will.
I would not draw a line at all. This idea that some people are free and others are not, and there's going to be a sharp line between them, I think it's crazy. It's like saying, where does red become purple? Yeah, there's no particular place. It's a continuum of control. Some people have more control or less control than others, but there's no line that says these people are free and those people aren't.
Your capacity for decision making could be operated without any defect and without any internal trouble, so to speak. And yet you're being deceived, yet you're being coerced, yet things are happening to you by other people that would qualify you as unfree. And so I think those lines should be drawn ethically and politically, not in terms of our account of what it is to be a free agent, so to speak.
Think about advertising. One scenario is you think, oh, I want to buy some nice cheese, and I'm looking for a shop that sells nice cheese, and you open the newspaper and you see an advertisement for a shop that sells nice cheese, and you think, you go there, that's great. You had a prior desire, and you got information that helped you follow that through. The other thing is you don't really want cheese, but kind of someone shows you some advert that associates cheese with whatever, being loved or attractive or something like that, which is a weird thing to, okay. But in that kind of situation, you are implanting a desire, and I'd say that's less free. And if I could optimize the product in a way that I get a craving for it, I'm even less free. Well, I can't resist the temptation of taking it, and I'm least free. So it's a question of degrees of freedom, I think.